When I began sharing ministry with local congregations back in 1985, I observed that churches as a whole were living in the 1950s. We sang out of hymnals where the newest hymn was over 100 years old. We used bulletins and orders of worship printed with typewriters and copied with Gestetner copiers. Now, if you're younger than 50, don't worry, you're not supposed to know what those things are. We used the organ as our only instrument for worship, so the church was about 2 generations behind the culture in which we lived. The church and the culture were experiencing what we called then a really big generation gap. Now, almost 4 decades later, I can say with confidence that worship in most congregations is usually at least 1 generation behind the culture going on around us. Most churches use screens and PowerPoints, thank goodness, and we try to use newer songs in worship, but most of the songs in any of our hymnals are no newer than 40 years ago. That's not that new, is it? And the words used in hardcover hymnals are beyond understanding by anybody under 60. The tune, where did that come from? Nobody remembers that most of them were bar songs from the 1700s. Yeah, really. Happily, Lakeshore is doing better than most with worship. You are using screens and images. Bravo. You're live streaming. Yay, team. Tracy Music, that's a good name. Tracy plays music that touches all of our hearts. And the words written in the bulletins and spoken aloud are mostly understandable. Pastor Cherie gives really good sermons and really great children's sermons. And yes, every pastor alive knows that most people listen to the children's sermon. You kind of wander during the adult sermon, but the children's sermon is much shorter, uses much simpler words and images that we can kind of hold on to. And it's usually about the idea of the morning. And I freely confess that there are times when I remember I spent a lot of time and money learning a lot of big and fancy words, and sometimes I use them because it's just fun. It's not helpful, but it's fun. The chief complaint amongst students at every level today is that teachers use, and I quote, too many words. Words for children and students today are confusing, for the words we use are mostly unknown to them. The ideas we try to teach are confusing because we use a lot of words to explain a complex idea. And whether we like it or not, written and spoken words are not the communication skills being learned and honed by most young people today. Now, my first reaction to that news is to tell parents and students, pick up a book. Read more, for heaven's sakes. That's the only way our vocabulary grows. Read. Put down your phones, put down your iPads, put down your laptops, and read. Rather than communicate through text, talk to each other. As the kid on the commercial, use your words, Mom. Instead of using Kick Message, TikTok, and Tumblr to send a message, talk to each other with words, maybe even face-to-face. Rather than using emojis to express a feeling, use words to let someone know how you feel. Does everybody know what an emoji is? The little symbols that mean something started with the smiley face. The smiley face was the first emoji. Well, my reaction to all of this simply shows just how out of touch I am with the way that language is evolving and changing. Like every generation past, language is using technology to change and grow in ways that meet the needs of young people today. Think back to, looking at most of us, the 60s. Do we use most of the language that was popular in the 60s? When was the last time you said groovy? Yeah, cool we still use. Pardon me? Neato. far out. Yeah. And right on, man. And usually in that tone and with that facial expression. Right on, man. Yeah. We don't use that language anymore because language changes. Language evolves to meet the need of the next generation. Instead of using letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, as the only meaningful symbols, language is making use of images that share ideas in ways that the ABCs simply cannot. Images that we find in TikTok, those are short videos, that often carry much more of a message than a 15-minute sermon ever would, are popular. Instagram, sending pictures, emojis are all the new symbols of communication. Jeremiah was a prophet in Jerusalem, and he used images to share the meaning of his message. Jeremiah spoke God's words to the people of Jerusalem before, during, and after the army from Babylon invaded and destroyed the city. At first he spoke words of warning, then he spoke words of disaster. Finally, he spoke words of hope. And Jeremiah didn't just speak. After the army from Babylon invaded and destroyed the buildings and the leaderships of the city, Jeremiah decided to use some actions and images. Jeremiah bought a vineyard just outside of the wall of the city. Now, Jeremiah knew that the Babylonian army was going to claim every inch of tillable land that was available. The soldiers didn't go home. Most of them stayed because they would get freedom from being in the army. They would stay and claim a piece of land that was given to them by the conqueror so that they could stay and grow what they wanted to grow. Most of them moved into homes that were already built by other people. They just told them to get out. It's mine now. That's the way it is sometimes with conquering armies. They take over. But Jeremiah bought a vineyard that surely would have been occupied by a Babylonian soldier, probably a commander or an officer, a way to make money to plan for the future. And by buying the vineyard, Jeremiah let people know that God's words of hope were real and true in a way that simply speaking those words never would. By buying the vineyard, Jeremiah was saying to the people, see, I know God's promise is true. One day, the Babylonian army will be defeated and kicked out. One day, the land and the homes will be ours again. One day, that vineyard is going to be mine to use. That was a word of hope, an action of hope that spoke more loudly than any of Jeremiah's words ever could. Now, don't get me wrong, Jeremiah used a lot of words of hope. In fact, he used 20 chapters worth of words of hope. I, for one, believe he talked way too much. As my mother would have said, he needed a really good editor. But the spoken word was the current language or communication of the day of 583 before the Common Era. But buying that vineyard, other people couldn't repeat what Jeremiah said because he used big fancy words also. I mean, God has a vocabulary. So Jeremiah used a symbol, a vineyard, that everybody could understand. Now, the pandemic invaded our lives as violently as the army of Babylon invaded Jerusalem. And like the people of 583 before the Common Era, we're waiting for life to go back to the way it used to be. Churches in particular are waiting for things to get back to the way they used to be. And in many ways they have. But most of us are waiting for those children and their families to return to worship. We're waiting for youth groups to once again terrorize the congregation. We're waiting for Sunday school to come back the way Sunday school was when we were growing up. Well, here's the good and the bad news. That's not going to happen. It's not happening in any United Methodist Church anywhere in Wisconsin. Our world, our culture, our businesses, our education, and our ways of communicating with each other has changed, and it's not going back. Our language and our styles of learning, teaching, doing business, sharing ideas, and communicating has changed, and it's not going back. Rather than using words, proper grammar, sentences, and paragraphs to share ideas and feelings, the language today is short videos, emojis, and different spellings to ideas and feelings. Now, I don't know about you, but when I write a text, and yes, I use text a lot, I spell out every word because I can't get past my grade school training. I know there are shorter and faster ways to do it. I can read and understand most of the texts my great nieces and nephews send to me, but it's hard for me to change my way. Which means most congregations are at least one generation behind. Again. So, how do we share Jesus in this new culture and in this new world? First, and this is important, stop rolling our eyes when we see a young child using an iPhone or an iPad or a cell phone, an iPad, or a laptop computer. And you know, I'm not the only one who does it. Because that child is learning the way of the current communication. That child is learning their language. Second, we can react with kindness when we see or hear short phrases, videos, and actions. Now, we can thank Tracy and Pastor Cherie every time we sing a new praise song. And no, you're not going to know it right away. That's okay. Because any song newer than 1982 will be very welcome to anybody who's younger than 50. And we could use some people younger than 50, don't you think? Yeah. So that's one way. And by the way, please, please, please support composers who write praise songs with good theology. And by good theology, I mean any songs that talk about God's love for all people, rather than theology that says turn or burn. You know what I mean by turn or burn? Yeah. Ugh. Bad theology. Bad. Then third, we can change our internal reaction when we see families sitting together, not talking, but using their phones, using their iPads, using their laptops to talk with each other. We can change our reaction when we see a toddler or a one-year-old or a two-year-old using a phone or an iPad. Instead, we can look at anyone with a phone or an iPad or whatever with love and recognize that they are so far ahead of us in learning that new language. We can look with love and maybe even a little bit of envy. And who doesn't like being looked at with a little bit of envy? Think how good it would feel for a child and a family to get that look of envy because they're learning a new language. And when the phone rings during worship, don't scold ourselves or the phone ringing person. Instead, encourage them to step outside and take the call. Why? Because that's how people communicate today. It might be the only time that your son or your grandson or your granddaughter or your niece or nephew is going to try to get hold of you. Please, let's not shame people for a ringing telephone. We can start with those three actions and reactions. Take practice. We have to catch ourselves rolling our eyes. We have to catch ourselves making snide remarks to the person next to us. We have to catch ourselves with our negative internal reactions and replace them with positives. Good for that child. Good for that parent. I wish I knew the new language, because I sure don't. Which means I miss a lot of what's going on in the world. Now, my guess is in order to catch up that generation, most congregations will need to grow a congregation within the current congregation that focuses on our changing language of our time, which means allowing people like you and me to continue to worship and have activities in the way that we are comfortable. Did you know there's an emoji Bible? I was surprised also. That's one of the first drafts. And God saw the light and saw that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. Now, the Emoji Bible, you can find it online, is a very incomplete Bible. But I would pay someone who was writing a complete translation. I'd be one of the people who was their patron to say, yay, go for it, because that's the language more and more people are going to understand. The language of the Bible, did you hear those names? Ay, 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 ay. I mean, David did a great job saying them, but who of us wanted to be liturgists today? So sometimes the Bible just confounds us. Just think of what it would be if there was an Emoji Bible. We could just look at it and we'd all know exactly what it says. And we might even understand it. So we're going to have to grow a congregation within a congregation. Let you and me stay the way we are, because are we really going to change all that much? Did our parents change in the 60s? They still loved Lawrence Welk. And some people still do. God bless them. And God bless PBS. But the new congregation would come about by members of the current congregation volunteering to work on a new worship service, a current language activity, and current language Christian education. To focus on groups that attract people who use a language that is changing and evolving, to be able to share ideas, not just using Mr. Rogers' language, but to share ideas using symbols that younger people can understand. Our language is changing, and many of us are those who remain after the invasion of the pandemic, and we can sit and bemoan our fate. Oh, where's the world coming to? We're going back to cave drawings. Or we can claim the hope that is found in the book of Jeremiah. Look at that new language. Isn't that exciting? Pastor Cherie asked me to invite anyone who wants to work on developing a new language congregation, its worship, its activities, its education, to contact her. Let me put it another way. Anyone who's looking to buy a vineyard, please contact Pastor Cherie. Amen.